brought back memories of tent revival. I was at, my mom and dad always took us to every tent revival there was. And it just made me grateful that my mom and dad cared enough for our kids and put us in church. Made sure that we were saved.
Absolutely.
And I was almost crying to that, just thinking about my parents,
That's good testimony. I appreciate you sharing that, Steve. And the pastor, the preacher that was preaching this past Sunday morning, he talked about, and I've heard other preachers say it, that he had a drug problem when he was a child. He was drugged every church service. And in the moment, a lot of times it can seem, even as the adult, it can seem like, we're struggling to get out the door. We may get there late or whatever. But boy, I have a heritage much like yours, Steve, and I'm so grateful for that drug problem.
I got drugs everywhere.
Visitation,
visiting,
I hear you, man.
anything that happened.
I hear you. Well, praise the Lord for it, right? We need more people like that today. All right, our assistant pastor, Brother Josh Lilly. It's his Wednesday night, man, and he's going to bring the word this evening. So, Josh, you come on, brother.
Good evening. Thank you for coming tonight. We're going to Psalm 78. And we're going to continue the D6 curriculum that Pastor Zach does. And we're going to do Psalm 78. 78? That's right, Doug. And the title of this message is Declaring God's Faithfulness. So often we hear that God is faithful. God is faithful, great is thy faithfulness. But, so often God's faithfulness is overlooked and it's often forgotten. And for multiple reasons, people forget that God is faithful. One reason is because we live in a broken world where people break their promises all the time. And it makes us, a little reluctant to trust people, to trust God. But Scriptures tell us that God is ever faithful. He's ever faithful. He is, 100% faithful all the time. Another reason people forget about God's faithfulness is because of lack of reminders. People, maybe they don't, go to church often. They don't be reminded by their pastor or their church, or maybe it's people they hang out with, and they're not often reminded that, hey, God is faithful. And my first point focuses on that type of thing. And my first point is parents are to teach their children about God's faithfulness. Teaching kids about God's faithfulness is influential, especially for kids, right? At that age, when you're a kid, everything your dad or your mom tell you is just true, right? And no questions asked. A child looks up so much to his mom, to his dad. I know when I was a kid, my dad would put salt on his watermelons, and that's how he'd eat it. And I thought it was cool, and I was little, and I was like, man, I'm gonna eat the watermelon like my dad ate it, right? And I didn't even like it. I thought it tasted kind of gross. But I just did it because I wanted to be like my dad, right? And to do that kind of silly thing, right? And that's just how kids are with their parents. They want to be like their parent, or the kids want to be like their mom, like their dad, right? And they hang on to every word that the parents tell the kids, right? And everything they say is gospel, is truth. I'm so blessed, so grateful that I grew up in a home where they reminded me daily of God's faithfulness. Obey Him and He will bless you, and God will be faithful to you. One of the worst things a parent can do to their kid is to not share God with them. God's attributes, God's power, God's faithfulness. Because kids, they need stability. They need stability far beyond their parents. They need more stability than that. And I'm going to read this passage, verse 1 through 4. And this passage is Asaph expressing the importance of making sure you express God's faithfulness to your children. So verse 1 through 4. It says, "Give ear, O my people, to my law. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in parable. I will utter dark sayings of old, which we have heard and known, our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from our children, showing to the generation to come praises of the Lord, and his strength and his wonderful works that he has done." Verse 3 tells us, Asaph is giving us a little introduction on what he's about to tell us, and he tells us that what he's about to tell us is nothing new. This is all stuff that, they talked about before. It's Old Testament stuff, and he's basically just re-declaring Deuteronomy 6. And he's telling them, tell your kids, tell the generation that is coming up about God's faithfulness. Verse 4, it tells us one reason why we should tell them about God's faithfulness, is so that they will continue to sing God's praises. People say that, and it's probably true, that the most influential, the most important years of your life is when you're a teenager to a young adult, right? Because in those years, you're making decisions. Who you're going to marry, what you're going to do, where you're going to go to college, stuff like that, and that's true. However, I also think before that, when you're a kid growing up, before you're a teenager, is also very important, right? Because it's that age where you start to figure out, okay, who am I? What's my identity? Who's my family? And kids, they love Jesus, right? And then when they grow up to be a teenager, then they make decisions based on what they knew as a kid. So, the verse tells parents, let it be known to you kids the wonderful things God has done. Make sure that they love God in those early years, right? When they're young and they're growing up, make sure they love God, make sure that they're pouring their love and all their attention onto God, so that when they are making decisions, it's based on that, right? It's based on what they knew as a child. My second bullet point, teaching your kids about God's faithfulness gives them stability. Stability is important, right? 1 Corinthians 15:58 says, "Therefore, my beloved brethren, be ye steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, for as much as ye know that your labor is not in vain." I'm not an expert on kids, but I do know that they need stability. And they need it far beyond their own parents. And what I mean by that is, when I was a kid, I was a Christian, I was stable, my parents gave me that stability, but I needed a little more stability because I was a little scared about, what happens when you die. I knew I was going to go to heaven, I knew I was a Christian, but I was still scared, right? As a kid, you get scared about that kind of stuff. And my parents, they told me, well, God's your stability. God will help you. God is on your side. And as a kid learning that, it gave me comfort. It gave me stability. This psalm talks about God's faithfulness to Israel even after they rebel against him. God made a promise with Abraham, with Israel, to continue his plan to work through Israel for the coming of the Messiah, even if they rebelled against them. Verse 4 through 6, they kind of re-emphasize the same point to teach to future generations. It echoes the commands given in Deuteronomy 6, where Moses, he said verses like this. I'm about to read Deuteronomy 6, 7 through 9. It says, "And thou shalt teach them, your children, diligently, and shalt talk of them when thou sittest in thy house, when you walkest by the way, when thou layest down, when thou risest up. And you shall bind them for a sign upon thy hand, and they shall be frontlets between the eyes, and thou shalt write them upon the posts of the house and on the gates." One of the questions this lesson curriculum asked was, what are some ways parents and grandparents can teach their children about God and his ways? I believe that what I just read are some examples, some techniques that we can do as, I'm not a parent, but some techniques that parents and grandparents can do for their children, to remind them of God's faithfulness. For example, tell them diligently. Tell them when they come by your way. Tell them when they go to bed. Tell them when they wake up. Write it on the posts of their house. When you die, like grandparents, when you die, the number one thing your grandkids should think about you is, man, they were godly, right? And that has such an impact on them. And man, every time I saw them, they were always sharing the gospel. And they were always living godly lives. And that should be your testimony. And that should be something that your grandkids look at you and always remember that about you. My grandma, she passed away, and I think about her, I always think about how much of a godly woman she was. And that plays a role in my life. And I think it can be the same way with your grandkids. And then, how sad would it be to miss those opportunities? To miss those opportunities to miss out, telling your grandchildren, your children about Jesus, about God's faithfulness, about God's power, His authority, and all that stuff. It would be sad because they would miss you would miss those opportunities to share an influence on them, to be an impact on them. They would grow up making possibly foolish decisions. Children who are not exposed to God's faithfulness will make foolish decisions. Verse 7 through 8. It says, that they might set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep His commandments, and might not be as their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that set not their heart aright, and whose spirit was not steadfast with God. These verses say that whoever doesn't express God's faithfulness, God's power, authority with their children are stubborn and foolish and rebellious. And why? Because those kids growing up, what's going to happen? They're not going to make the right decisions. They're not going to have a godly foundation that will affect those future decisions. Be wise. Tell your kids, tell your grandkids, because not only is the right thing to do, but because it's a command from God. It's what we ought to do. You can make an influence on them. Your kids and grandkids may not respond the way you would like them to, but that doesn't mean you're not influencing. I remember when I was a kid and I was playing baseball, and we had games on Wednesdays and Sundays, and I remember like, oh no. When I learned about that, I was like, oh no. My parents they're not going to let me play. So I tried asking. I was like, hey Mom, we play on Wednesdays. Can I go? Of course, she said, not at all. No way. You got church. Sunday's the same thing, right? And at the time, I was, that made me a little upset, all right? I was like, man, I'm a good kid, Mom. I mean, I'm a Christian, and I go to church all the time. Just let me do this, and no chance. And, even though it affected me and bothered me back then, growing up, that burned in my brain that church is first, that Christ comes first, that, priority number one is church, right? Is Jesus Christ. That gave me the right understanding. It helps me sort out my priorities when I would make decisions, and that doesn't just go for sports games. That goes for everything, right? I think if you have kids and grandkids, that the one thing you should express to them is, hey, God comes first. God comes before entertainment, comes before sports, comes before whatever you want to do, but God comes first. Matthew 6:33 says, seek ye the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you. I think your kids and grandkids should have that understanding of God, that He priority number one, even when it's inconvenient, even when they're busy, even if they want to do something else, God's still number one. So, and not only is that good for them, but it gives them more stability, right? Stability, rock solid foundation. My second point is God remains faithful even when we are not. Psalm 78 is a psalm of instruction. It covers Israel's history between Egypt, when they came out of Egypt, and then the time of David. And And in it we see the failure of God's people and the faithfulness of God. Verse 9 through 11. It says, the children of Ephraim, being armed and carrying bows, turned back in the day of the battle. They kept not the covenant of God. They refused to walk in his law. They forgot his works and his wonders that he had showed them. The Ephraimites, they're a tribe of Israel, but in this instance they represent the nation of Israel. And what they did here was they refused to go to battle, which was a disobedient act against God. And God took note of it. And despite all the miraculous works that God did for them, they still rebelled. And they forgot God's faithfulness, and they refused to obey him. And you know, it's so easy for people, us, and everyone to point at the Israelites and be like, man, what were you thinking, right? You know, God has split the Red Sea, he's made it rain manna from the sky. What were you thinking to disobey God? But you know, I think of that saying when it goes, when you point a finger at someone, there's three more pointing back at you, right? Because, you know, God was evident clearly in their life. He did miraculous works for them. But, you know, there's an argument to be made that God is just as, if not more, evident in our lives today. You say, well, hold on. I never saw the Red Sea split, right? I never saw it rain manna from heaven. And that's true, right? We haven't. But he did something better. He did something more evident. He did something miraculous. And it is he lives in us. He saved us. The Holy Spirit works in us through and through every day. It's a compass. It's a conscience. It's a guidance direction. It moves us. And even though we have God himself living through us every day, and that's evidence enough, but even though we have that, we still tend to disobey him. And we tend to forget his faithfulness and all the good things that he has done. We tend to drift away. I'm sure everyone has heard the hymnal, Come Thy Fount. You know, the hymn, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing, was written by Robert Robinson in 1758. Robinson's life was marked by hardship and loss, including the death of his father when he was just 8 years old. His mother sent him to London for apprenticeship, where he lived a life of debauchery and sin, until he was converted to Christianity by George Whitefield. Robinson's conversion led him to be a minister and eventually write the hymn, Come Thy Fount. After he wrote the hymn, it grew in popularity. He became pretty famous. However, he resorted back to a life of sin. And he became miserable, he became lonely. And one day, Robert Robinson, he was riding on stagecoach, and he overheard a young woman humming the tune to Come Thy Fount. And particularly this lyric, which is prone to wander, Lord, I feel it, prone to leave the God I love. Here's my heart, Lord, take and seal it for thy courts above. And she asked him what his opinion was on this hymn. And his eyes filled with tears as he replied, Madam, I am the poor, unhappy man that wrote that hymn many years ago, and I would give 1,000 worlds, if I had them, to enjoy the feelings I had then. You know, sometimes we feel prone to wander, right? I know every time we sing that song in church, that verse, that's what gets me the most, right? We're prone to wander, we're prone to leave the God that we love. And it's just because we're sinners. We're sinful, sin nature, and it's sad, but it's just a natural feeling. However, it is wise to not drift, right? It is wise to stay close to God. And why is it that sometimes we forget all the great things God does for us? It's because we drift, right? We drift and we drift from God, and we don't stay close to him. We have God living in us, and as important as that is, it's not enough to be close to him, to have a relationship with him. I believe one reason we forget also is because we focus too much on other things, on simple things. We lack the Word. We lack spending time with him. We tend to drift. When we drift, it's easier to sin more and more. The Ephraimites, they didn't just forget God's faithfulness, but they continued to sin against them, right? Verse 17, I'm going to jump to verse 17. They continue to live their life of sin. It says, and they sinned yet more against him by provoking the Most High in the wilderness. And they tempted God in their heart by asking meat for their lust. Yea, they spake against God. They said, can God furnish a table in the wilderness? These verses tell us they provoked God. They asked God to feed them. They questioned God's power and his ability. J. Vernon McGee, he commented on this verse in his commentary on Psalms. He said, this represents the type of unbelief that is seen among believers today. It is practical atheism on the part of God's people. When I first read that, I was like, that's kind of harsh, right? It's practical atheism on God's people. And then I looked up, well, what is practical atheism? What's the definition? And this is it. Practical atheism is the state of living as if God does not exist, even while maintaining a belief in God's existence. I'll say that again. The state of living as if God does not exist, even while maintaining a belief in God's existence. I think it's very easy to be a victim of practical atheism. We believe in the existence of God. We know he's out there. We know he's watching over us. But just have a hard time believing in his intervention, that he will actually help us, that he'll actually clear the waters for us and make a way for us so that we could solve our problems. You know, people say, I know God is real, but man, I doubt he's going to help me in this situation. Or, you know, I think I'm kind of on my own with this problem. Why would God waste his time with me and my problems? You know I can get that way sometimes too. And that's how the Ephraimites were. They were doubting God, demanding from God, provoking God, but yet God's faithfulness. Look at God, what God did, verse 23. And you might not find a better example in the Bible of God's faithfulness than these three verses. It says, though he had commanded the clouds from above and opened the doors of heaven, and had rained down manna upon them to eat, and had given them the corn of heaven, man did eat angels' food, he sent them meat to the full. The Ephraimites were so unbelievably unfaithful to God. They were doubting him, they were sinning against him, they were provoking him, but yet God intervened in a positive way. God helped them, God fed them, and God does the same thing for us today. Even when we are unfaithful, God still intervenes in positive ways. Even when I'm not faithful, or even I forget to pray, or forget to read my Bible, or choose something meaningless over spending time with God, God still intervenes and works in my life in positive ways. He's still faithful, even when I'm so undeserving of it. I remember in college, I was in 10th grade, and I was not where I was supposed to be spiritually. I was just kind of drifting and just kind of lazy mainly, and just not where I was supposed to be. And I remember one day just sitting down and realizing, man, I'm not at all what I'm supposed to be doing here at Bible college, right? But yet, God is still blessing me. I'm still stable financially. I still have so many friends, and my family, they still love me, and everything's perfect or close to perfect, and I'm in a good spot right now, and yet I've been so unfaithful. And I convinced myself that the reason God was blessing me, even though I was not where I should have been, was because, well, maybe my grandparents are praying for me, right? Maybe it's God answering their prayers. And it's not so much me as much as it is them. Or maybe my parents are praying for me, or my church. It's like, that must be why God is blessing me when I'm being so unfaithful. And I accepted that, but now I see that it's more than that. It's because God is faithful. I took a step into God's will, and God blessed me for it. And he was faithful to me. And I'm so grateful for that. And it made me reconsider how I was spending my time with him. He remained faithful to me in a time where I wasn't faithful to him. And God is so good for that. And God still works that way today. He's faithful to us when we're not faithful to Him. And my third and last point, God is always faithful to keep His promises. And it's easy to wonder why. I've talked a lot about God being faithful, but why? Why even after they rebelled against God, they sinned against Him, they doubted God, after all these terrible things they did to God, why would God still help them, still bless them? It's because He promised, right? He promised. He promised Abraham, He promised Israel that, I will be your father, you are my chosen nation. I will bless you. We will be the nation that, I'll bring up David, and he will be the line that brings the Messiah, and I will help you. And that's why they were blessed, because God is faithful to the promise that He made. Well, good news, God made a lot of promises to us, and promises that He's going to be faithful to us about. Some examples. Some examples, I'll just name a few. Protection and rescue from danger and harm, traps. Protection from temptation. God promises to provide a way out of temptation. Protection from fear and anxiety. God offers peace that will surpass all understanding, replacing anxiety with His presence and assurance. From enemies, God promises to defeat our enemies and overcome adversity. God promises provision and guidance. Physical needs, spiritual guidance, strength and grace. God's constant presence, that's another promise. He promises to be with us always. And that's just some of the promises that God made to us. I'm going to read verse 65 through 72. And this is God's promise to make Abraham's descendants a great nation. And I'll just read it. Verse 65, Psalm 78. It says, "The Lord awaked as one out of sleep, and like a mighty man that shouted by reason of wine, and He smote His enemies in the hinder parts, and put them to perpetual reproach. Moreover, He refused the tabernacle of Joseph, and He chose not the tribe of Ephraim. But He chose the tribe of Judah, the mount of Zion, which He loved. And He built a sanctuary like high palaces, like the earth which He hath established forever. He chose David, also His servant, took him from the sheepfolds, from following the ewes, great with young. He brought him to feed Jacob His people, and Israel His inheritance. So He fed them according to the integrity of His heart. He guided them by the skillfulness of their hands." This passage, it talks about, the first thing it says is God awakens out of sleep. It's a metaphor of His intervention in Israel's life. On behalf of His people who are facing defeat and despair, He intervened. This awakening is followed by God's action to deliver them out of the hands of their enemies. He also talked about how God intervened to make Abraham's descendants into a great nation, to bless them, to give them land of Canaan as an everlasting possession. God promised to be their God, to bless all nations through them. And then it focuses on David's selection as king. It emphasizes that God took him out of the sheepfolds to be a shepherd for His people. This act is presented as a direct fulfillment of God's promise, a demonstration of His faithfulness. God kept all these promises He made because He's faithful, and we should let it be known to people today, the faithfulness of God. To our kids, to our grandkids, strangers, to everyone, just let it be known that, hey, my God is faithful, right? He's promised to help us. And we live in a sin-cursed world, but yet God promises to help us get through it together. And we just got to be faithful. We got to be consistent. We got to tell others about Him, and God will be faithful. I named all the examples of ways God promises us, right? Guidance and all that stuff. And that's just some, but there's way more promises God makes to us than what I said. And we just need to be faithful to Him, and we should be grateful for it. So in conclusion, when it comes to God's faithfulness, just remember, first thing, tell your kids, tell your grandkids, remind them, write it on the walls, whatever, right? The posts of the house walls, whatever. just let it be known, right? I know that plays a huge role in how their lives. If they just know that their parent or their grandparent is godly, it genuinely plays a big role in their decision making and their love for Jesus. Because kids, they love Jesus a lot more than some of us, right? And that affects their decisions later on. Secondly, remember, God remains faithful when we are not. You know, so often we're not faithful, we're sinning, and yet good things God still blesses us. And you know, that's just something to be grateful for. It's just Him being faithful to His promise to us, all right? And we should do the same with that. And then thirdly, God always keeps His promises. God always keeps His promises. He'll help us, He'll guide us, He'll lead us, help us leave temptation, all that stuff, right? So I encourage you. I'm trying to be better at leaving a word of encouragement before I end the message. I just encourage you and myself to acknowledge God's faithfulness and tell others about Him. Whether it's your grandkids, your kids, just do something maybe this week or next week. Just share something with them. Let it be known to strangers, to friends, whoever, that, hey, man, God's been faithful to me, even when I don't deserve it. He's been faithful to me. And thank Him. Be grateful, thank Him for it.
Amen.
Well done, Mr. Good job, good work tonight. All right, and I thought it was interesting, you was talking about childhood and raising your kids to follow the Lord. Went right along with what you had said, Steve, before you got up here. So. All right, you should have your prayer list there in front of you. So if anyone would like to mention anybody in prayer, I was going to mention Lloyd Hudson.